and we hope you will stick around for this important conversation, which we're going to jump right into. I'm going to go ahead and spotlight Rabbi Blumenthal. And let's see, here we go. Let's go ahead and spotlight me as well for now. And we are going to jump right into it. Rabbi Blumenthal, I just figured maybe you can start us off with some of your initial thoughts and perhaps say a word a little about, we may be able to get into this later as well, but say a word about the genesis of how you ended up as the chief executive of both the Rabbinical Assembly and then ultimately USCJ, because I'm sure that's also an interesting thing for our congregants to understand how that came about.
Great, I'd love to. First of all, again, a thank you to everybody. And now that I'm seeing Rabbi Rothman and Rabbi Wallach also on the screen, it's good to see you as well. And thank you as well for the warm welcome. And also, before I even start, I want to, since one of the ways that I'm happy to use technology on Shabbat, but I try to differentiate certain things in terms of how I use it. So one of the things is I don't tend to type a lot on my screen. But I saw a great question from Glenn about my Dvar Torah as it was scrolling through on my screen. So there are 3 times where the Israelites get thirsty, 2 of them in this parasha. So the first one, Moshe solves it by taking a piece of wood, a special piece of wood, and putting it into the brackish water and making it sweet to drink. The second story, also in this week's parasha, is the one that I talked about, where he takes the same staff and strikes the rock and water comes forth. And then there's a third story in the book of Numbers in Bimidbar, where God says specifically, don't strike the rock, but speak to the rock. And Moshe doesn't listen. And actually the sermon I would take from that, and the one that actually could lead into my answer to Rabbi Sunshine's question, is Moshe can't adapt to a new situation. He tries to use the same instrument that he used the last time. And even though it actually works, it has long-term consequences. In other words, like, yes, the water flows from it, but he didn't rise to his full potential in that story by speaking to the rock and having even more faith than using a physical act, having the faith in words to be able to also work miracles. So it's a great story. And Glenn, thank you for calling our attention to the difference between those 2 stories. And it actually is a great way of talking about what I'm doing now, which is, I was a pulpit rabbi for 20 years. And then, and all during that time, I actually did, as I like to say to my congregation, I needed hobbies. So one of my hobbies was to work with the Rabbinical Assembly, because I love rabbis, and Rabbi Sunshine is a great example of that. And Rabbi Rothman and Rabbi Wallach. I won't play favorites on this call. And also because it allowed me even though I worked in a relatively small congregation, to have sort of a big picture of what was going on, certainly in North American Jewry, and the Rabbinical Assembly is actually a global institution. So also to have contact with colleagues all over the world. So I did a lot of lay leadership, pieces as a rabbi in the Rabbinical Assembly. And when this position came open to become the CEO, somebody, I'm not sure who, sort of convinced me to put my kippah into the ring, and it happened to work out. A number of things also were happening at the same time. So some of this is sort of the luck of timing, and some of it was more intentional. One is that the United Synagogue, the USCJ, which is our congregational arm for the conservative movement, 560 congregations across North America, it turned out was also looking for had an opening, was also looking for a CEO at the same time. My predecessor, Rabbi Steve Wernick, took a position with one of our largest congregations in North America, in Toronto, and at Beth Tzedek. And so he left the position vacant. That's the first thing. And the second was that I think, just like the lesson from the story of Moses and speaking to the rock, there was a growing realization that doing things the same way was not going to result in continued success for the conservative movement, that we had to think about new models. And one of those models needs to be around partnership, that we have to learn as institutions to reduce our own institutional egos and think about how we're going to partner and collaborate to create more strength. And the leaders of USCJ and the Rabbinical Assembly, I think, realized that we couldn't start to ask that until we also modeled it. And so we began thinking about what would the strengths be if the rabbis of our movement and the synagogue arm of our movement actually came together in close collaboration and began to work together. And one of the ways to do that might be to start with the CEO position. So actually, there are two separate positions. I actually serve concurrently in both. Half my salary is paid by each organization. And in recent months, we've actually decided that our short and medium term goal is not a merger of the two organizations, it's actually a strategic alignment. In other words, we're going to look at which other positions might be shared, like the CEO position, and also how we can align our staffs to work towards greater impact out in the world, and then take a look at our budgets as well and see how we want to spend our resources, in a combined way. Even though we're going to keep two separate bank accounts, we're going to keep two separate boards, and some of our institutional structures will remain separate. We felt that working on all those structural pieces would be a huge distraction, especially in time of COVID, but even post-COVID. We'd rather be focused on our impact in the world and what kinds of new things we could do. Ari, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm back with you. Yeah, sorry, I was trying to hit unmute. Well, so now that let's get to the big elephant in the room, which is the future of the conservative movement, right? What's your, now you're talking about strategic alignment of the RA and the USCJ. What do you see in terms of the, not only the present, but the near-term future and the direction we're heading? Are you optimistic? Are you concerned? Sort of where do you fall on that? And tell us a little bit why you think so.
Great. So first of all, my own understanding is there are two things about the Jewish people. The first thing is that we are kvetchers, we are complainers. And the second is that we are eternal optimists. We have however we understand the idea of the Mashiach, the Messiah, we do always have this sense that the world is going to get better, not worse, in the long term, even if in the short term we have setbacks. And so, first of all, I'm coming from that other perspective, not just complaining, but also hoping and being optimistic. And second of all, it's actually what I think rabbis do. Our job as rabbis, we also inherit, more than we inherit the sense of priesthood of religious leadership, I think we more inherit the sense of prophecy, which is to make sure that we're not just warning about present danger, but also giving a hopeful direction to the future. So in general, my orientation is to be optimistic. However, I think it's backed up well. When I think of our movement, I think of it in two pieces, and those pieces obviously come together, but we can think of them a little bit separately. The first is our own ideology. What are the ideas that drive us forward? We are a centrist movement that takes the best of tradition and balances it with the needs of the present in terms of the changes we need to make to transform that tradition into something that is relevant, living, and breathing in the current space, and allows us to move forward as a people into the future. There is no better time or no more important time for us to be thinking about what it means to be in the center. We are seeing cultural and religious trends across North America that are pushing us towards the extremes. We have been living that for a very long time, quite frankly. And we see it in religious life, we see it in our broader culture. And we need to be thinking about, and I'm very hopeful, quite frankly, that the pendulum is now swinging, as all of these do, back towards the center. And so I think there's actually a moment for us as conservative Jews who inhabit that centrist space within North American Judaism, for us to be able to be the space in which some of that coming back together towards the center will happen. So that's number one. Number two is I see across all of our institutions, whether it's our synagogues, whether it's our seminaries, whether it's USCJ and the RA, a really important trend, which is the institutional egos that inhabited our spaces earlier in the 20th century have given way to much more humility as institutions, both as the leaders of those institutions and, quite frankly, I think that institutions themselves have egos. And as we have let go of those, we have actually discovered the spaces in which we can come together to collaborate and cooperate. no one institution in the movement needs to be the leader, and no leader within the movement needs to be the leader of our movement. Instead, we can open up the space to be able to do a lot of important work. And by the way, the reason I think that's important is because each of our institutions has actually taken a step back and understood its core function. So the Rabbinical Assembly, you know, my elevator on one foot word is, we support and connect our rabbis. The Cantors Assembly supports and connects our cantors. United Synagogue supports and connects our synagogues and their leaders and our teams. That's the work that we do. The good news is that we have now focused much more in those spaces. The unfortunate thing is that there's a lot of other stuff that our movement needs to do that falls through the cracks, especially when it comes to things like college students, folks who have finished college or post-college age, but don't have children and aren't coming into our synagogues necessarily, because many of our synagogues focus a lot just on families with children and then empty nesters. You know, what about people of color? What about folks who want to combine their social activism with their Judaism and Jewish values? There are a lot of spaces where, what about the LGBTQ plus community, which is not as drawn into our congregations and our movement as they should be? How are we going to both transform our congregations to welcome those folks, but also perhaps create new models of direct engagement as a movement, supported by our network of synagogues and our professionals and clergy, but doing that work together as partners to find people where they are and being able to do that work. So that's my hope as we come together, is that we're going to move into those kinds of spaces.
Great. By the way, friends, Rabbi Blumenthal, we're gonna go through a couple more questions, but I'd also encourage, if you have other questions that you'd like to ask, you can put them in the chat box, and we'll try to get to at least a few of them during our remaining time together. So tell me what you think it means. You're talking to a group of congregants here from Shereth Israel and Dallas. So what does it mean for members of synagogues to be connected to the conservative movement? Like, you know, everybody's, you know, we think on the grassroots level, this is my community, this is my shul. So how could we think differently about what it means to be a part of a movement? How would you speak to that?
Beautiful. First of all, we do have a shared approach to Torah, right? The fact that, you know, we're using, in my case, it's the small edition of the Eitz Chaim, but I saw many folks this morning either using the larger edition or they were using a PDF that they downloaded. You know, we're using a Siddur together, right? I'll turn it the right way. And so we're using materials that aren't just, we're using the same book, but it also reflects the same approach to Torah. It's an intellectually honest approach that balances our sense of sort of inspiration, even divine inspiration for our tradition, with a sense that it's melded to a human process of authorship and context. We as a movement believe that Judaism continues to evolve in each time and place. And so that means that there are differences in the way our Judaism is expressed in different parts of the world. So the Judaism that we develop in Jerusalem or in Dallas or in Southern California or in Buenos Aires or in Paris, there might be differences actually in what that looks like. At the same time, our approach is the same, that we actually use that sense of evolution and adaptation to understand that that's the way Judaism works. And it's not a sense of radical reform of Jewish tradition, nor is it an ossification of Jewish tradition as well. It's actually a beautiful, if nuanced and complicated balance that creates a very broad center. So first of all, by being part of your community, you're affirming that approach is meaningful and helpful in the 21st century. Institutionally, it means that you're not doing this work alone. So as a congregation, you're not trying to figure out what that balance of tradition and change is on your own, nor is Rabbi Sunshine or Rabbi Rothman or Rabbi Wallach or Cantor's Rebker, right? We are actually engaged in a movement-wide conversation around what these mean. And so, for example, what does it mean to take a Shabbat service and put it online? What's the balance between the use of technology versus the use of tradition? To what extent are we having an experience of a minyan, saying Mourner's Kaddish together? And to what extent are we holding off on certain pieces? Like I noticed in your congregation's interpretation of what it means to be online. We're not doing Baruch Hu and we're not doing the Kedusha and the Amidah, right? Other congregations have different conclusions to that, by the way, but they are using the same process of nuanced conversation to be able to struggle with that. And our rabbis are having robust conversations online about what their decisions are and why they're making them. So we are part of a much broader conversation around that. At the same time, I would love for our movement, excuse me 1 second. You don't have to hear my coughing in your earphones. But at the same time, I'm hoping that institutionally we will actually broaden that conversation to think about what else we could be doing out in the world. How could our synagogues be, and our synagogue network, be the basis for even more work that we could do to affect the Jewish world? How could we be a bigger presence online? How could we be a bigger presence with college students, with young adults, with all sorts of other populations that I talked about, who aren't necessarily coming into our synagogue buildings? I think that we're going to find that the hallmark of the 21st century is that we have to find people where they are. So our relationship with synagogues isn't just what are we doing for each other, but also how are we collaborating and partnering as a network to do stuff out in the world? That is going to be a big shift, actually, as we think about how we expand our reach into those spaces. And this is the beginning of a conversation that I'd like to have with your congregation, with lots of other congregations and rabbis and other clergy and professionals, to see about how we move into that space.
So just let's pick up with that. There are a couple questions which I'll get to in a moment that have just come in, but in terms of collaboration, in terms of especially rethinking synagogue life and Jewish communal life amidst COVID and the way we create community. So what do you see? What do you see going on? I know you and I had a brief conversation last week or so. I was surprised to find out that this is the first time you've been invited to join a shul on Shabbat morning to speak. We also had Rakefet Ginsburg, as I told you, from Masorti just a couple weeks ago, and it struck me. And we were the first congregation she had visited. So I said to you, that seems surprising to me. Not that this not so much the feather in our cap, but just surprising that there aren't more congregations, perhaps, trying to do this looking outwards work. So do you want to speak to that a little bit, and what your thoughts about how we maybe get there a little more?
Well, so first of all, my calendar is now filling up. So as I've started to talk more with, and at the USCJ, we have a structure of, we have 7 districts across the country, 6 synagogue consultants that work with them. And now in the past couple of months, I've been slowly speaking with the leadership of each of those districts. And you guys are a part of our central district with Mindy Cohen in Chicago. And so as I've done that, and I've talked about these same kinds of issues, that creates an opportunity for dialogue. And I'm now finding that, first of all, my calendar is beginning to fill up, not always on Shabbat morning. And by the way, some of it is also my own sense that congregations needed a few months just to really solidify their own internal sense of community online before they began to, move outward. So I'll say a third piece of it is, quite frankly, my own sense that I don't like to walk into a job and think that I know what needs to happen. I've only been in this position with USCJ since July, and I really wanted to get a sense first that I understood what was happening in our congregations, that I understood the impact of COVID on those congregations, that I had talked with a lot of synagogue leaders before I started wanting to go out and, press these ideas. The last piece is that we actually have a working group, what we call a joint steering committee of the Rabbinical Assembly and USCJ, to manage our partnership and collaboration. And that group also had to spend 6 months deciding, okay, where do we want to go, right? Do we want to focus on our own internal structure, or do we want to start to talk about the impact that we as a movement need to have, and how we're going to invite, not just do it ourselves, but actually invite lots of other partners in? So you guys are indeed my first Shabbat morning guest experience, at least online. I was doing it as part of the RA before. But, you know, I come to it both with a sense of continued openness, but also some confidence, you know, in the kinds of things I want to talk about. So I appreciate the opportunity. Plus, it's always good when I can make Rabbi Sunshine my guinea pig. He was, you know, he was one of my first regional presidents as a youth director, and he got the good and the bad from that. So I figured, you know, I can bring the good and the bad to your show too. So it's kind of fun.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Let's play the other side of that coin for a minute. So question that just came in. So while we're talking about expanding boundaries, right, or letting them melt away on some level in terms of people being able to connect more broadly across geography, what would you say to folks who are worried that only, let's say, the biggest congregations are going to survive, local ties might suffer because everyone can get the Torah from the most affluent and well-connected congregations, you know, with the best tech, et cetera, et cetera. What would you say to folks like that and wondering about that question?
Yeah, that is going to be one of the key questions that every congregation in, you know, across the world is going to be asking itself. And I hope that they will ask it. In other words, what I'm hoping every congregation says is, what are our strengths and what are the things that we need to collaborate or count on others to do? So I'll give you an example. So, you know, one of the things that we've been trying to allow our clergy to do is to spend as much time as possible reaching out to families in their communities. You know, to be checking in regularly, to create networks for congregants to connect with each other, to be able either at bedside if they are able to do it, or if not, by whatever means necessary, to be present for congregants who are facing illness, either COVID or other kinds of illness in a particularly lonely time. Right? Our rabbis are very overwhelmed. So one of the things that we thought to do was, I know in my own rabbinate that teaching adult education was one of the most rewarding experiences, but also one that took a lot of time, because every hour of teaching requires certainly more than an hour and often many hours of preparation to feel confident and you know and competent to be able to teach whatever the material is. So we decided to create a network that we called Scholar Stream. We invited congregations to be sponsors, and I think Shareth Israel has been a part of this. And we brought content from some of our best teachers from JTS and from the Ziegler Rabbinical School. And in the end, we had 130 congregations and their rabbis who said, you know what, we're going to make this our 4-week adult education experience. And we ended up with over 1,000 people studying each of those 4 weeks with great scholars. And we're continuing again. We have another session of it this month, and we'll have another session before Pesach with other movement sponsors. And it could be that this is a hint of, you know, the kinds of things that congregations could not have to do on their own, that they could form either local, you know, regional networks or part of this continental network to get that kind of content and spend more time thinking about the relationships they're building inside their congregations. By the way, large congregations are feeling at a disadvantage because in a period where it's a people first Jewish experience that we're trying to get, it's super hard for a large congregation to feel a sense of connection and for people to feel a real sense of personalized connection. I mean, one of the things I'm noticing about what Rabbi Sunshine has done just this morning is to be so aware of all the things that are happening in congregants' lives, right? You have really taken that on as a challenge, and I'm so impressed by the way that that's reflected back in the experience this morning in Shul, right? Many congregations are struggling with that. Smaller congregations, I had a congregation that grew from about 50 to 300 households, and I loved it because I knew every single congregant. They, by and large, knew each other. They would walk into a room and we didn't have to introduce themselves as much. That's a real strength also for small congregations, even if they don't have the resources. And in fact, this could be a period that if we make the right resources available, you won't have to feel like you have to join as big of a congregation to get some of those same resources if, you know, they choose to take advantage of a larger network. And at the same time, a place like Shareth Israel and our other larger well-resourced congregations could become a resource to those smaller congregations, right? So I think it's actually a time of great balancing. And there are strengths to each kind of organization. What we need to do is make sure that every organization understands, is self-aware of itself and its strengths, and capitalizes on those as much as possible.
Great. Let me come back to a question that actually came up earlier from a congregant when you were sort of laying out your vision, your optimism, and your vision of where the movement is heading, and strategic partnerships and what have you. How are you going to know that the steps you've outlined have been successful? What kind of metrics are you planning on using, or is it just going to be a we'll know it when we see it kind of thing?
Right. So, especially when we're talking about moving from what I call a 1960s program model to what I think of as an engagement model, that's a great question. Like, what are the metrics of success? In other words, I think we used to only measure success by how many member families does our congregation have? How many people are in our religious school? How many people come on Shabbat morning, right? How many people was our standard question. And now we have to ask another question, which is, how much are we impacting people? How deeply are people feeling, having a sense of experience that really creates meaning and benefit in their lives, connects them with each other, connects them to God, connects them to a sense of spiritual experience and to a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives? That's a little harder to measure. One of the, Rabbi Sunshin mentioned this project that we started in Washington called The Den, which was an effort to use this kind of engagement theory in a really radical way to engage folks mostly in their 20s and 30s, singles and young couples, mostly before they have children, although now it's been around for 4 or 5 years, and thankfully many of them have gotten married and they're starting to have children. Some of them are staying within that network, by the way, and some of them are actually moving now into our congregations. It's interesting to see it happen. And one of the things that we started to realize is, so on the one hand, we do have all sorts of metrics. So we have metrics for how many coffee dates did the rabbi and a couple of other staff people have over the course of a month? How many people did they touch? How many people, both either attended a Shabbat dinner with the rabbi or in the end hosted a Shabbat dinner with others in the community with some assistance from the rabbi ahead of time to get it set up and to help them feel confident and ready, right? So first of all, if we start to measure not just who came into quote unquote the building, the Den doesn't have a building, but how many people are actively engaged in the network, we get some very interesting numbers. And we have a CRM, a relationship management system that gives that kind of data back to us. So that's number one. Number two is we learned that we also have to create anecdotes. Like, we have to actually have people tell us their story of their experience and gather those stories together as a way of understanding what the impact is and how it's changing people's lives. And by the way, when I start reading these stories of impact, they're unbelievable. The stories of couples who, one is not Jewish, they weren't really sure about how they wanted to create their Jewish home, and through sustained contact with both the rabbi and with others in the community, really made decisions about how they were going to raise their children, how they were going to put a mezuzah up on their doorpost, how they were going to really embrace Judaism as part of their family life. And one at a time, these anecdotes really build to a story of real impact. So yeah, there's different ways that we can use numbers if we measure things other than just how many people are attending a particular program. And there are also ways that we can use surveys and other kinds of anecdotal evidence to tell those stories.
Great, thank you. Another question that just came in, can you maybe speak to, there's a complicated, well, on some level simple, on another level complicated relationship between the conservative movement, or I should say non-Orthodox movements in the United States and the Orthodox hierarchy in the state of Israel. So a question that came in is, what are, as a movement, what are the current steps that are ongoing? I'm paraphrasing the question because I'm just trying to broaden it slightly. What are the current steps that are ongoing in terms of trying to create more, I'll use the word legitimacy, more of a presence and a foothold in the state of Israel. We talked about that a bit with Rakefet, of course, a couple weeks ago, but I'm curious sort of to put that to you. The question was framed specifically about the recognition of our Jewish status, from the Orthodox perspective in Israel, but I'd maybe tackle that just a little more broadly, just to give us some of your thoughts.
Sure. So, and this is a good week, quite frankly, to talk about it. This week, the Interior Ministry in Israel gave a response to a case that we brought in the Supreme Court about a Jewish individual from Uganda who's part of the Abo Yudaya community, which is a small community in Africa and Uganda, who's been living in Israel with a visa and now wants to make Aliyah. And the government has rejected that. The Interior Ministry rejected his application for Aliyah because he's not part of what they would call a recognized community. In other words, because they're ambivalent about the conversions that we have done for that community in Uganda, and the Masorti conservative rabbi who's ordained by the Ziegler School, who is the chief rabbi of the community, they don't want to allow him to make Aliyah. So we have a court case at the Supreme Court to deal with that issue. And as part of their response, the Interior Ministry, whose head is Aryeh Deri, who's an ultra-Orthodox, who's part of an ultra-Orthodox party, part of Shas, has declared that they don't recognize that community and therefore he can't make Aliyah. That's their position. And it's all based on the fact that we are not seen as fully legitimate in terms of our rabbis and our conversions. So first of all, I think we have to put it into context, which is that this is not just directed at us. We see this in sort of there's a broader piece where Israel is becoming more fundamentalist and more right-wing in both its religion and its politics. And the non-Orthodox community in North America continues to be much more complex or left-leaning in its politics. And has a more liberal understanding of the balance between tradition and change. And these two communities are definitely like moving slowly. I would say they're like tectonic plates, but they're moving slowly apart and creating a gap. And the question is, can that be solved? I'm not sure. I'm not as optimistic, quite frankly, about solving that gap. But there are instruments in Israel, like the Supreme Court, that can be helpful. It's also not helpful because the way politics work in Israel is that minorities actually have a lot of power in coalition agreements, and therefore the needs that we have from outside the state of Israel are less important than any given government's needs to usually include the ultra-Orthodox as part of it. So, we work in a number of different ways. We're certainly working within the court system, and my guess is, quite frankly, that the government would like not to pick this fight with us, but they feel beholden to their ultra-Orthodox allies in the coalition, or in the future, the next coalition, since this one is falling apart. And it may be that the Supreme Court decision, which we are advocating for together with the reform movement, will help solve that problem. So we will see. And that's why we, quite frankly, have not given a full court press in the media, both here and in Israel, about this, because that full court press doesn't really help us with the Supreme Court. Once the decision is made, and we anticipate it's going to be in our favor, then we can have a full court press to demand that the Israeli government uphold the decision and give a visa to not only Mr. Kabita, who's the current plaintiff, but other folks from not just Uganda, but in other communities throughout South America and in Africa and in other places where this is an issue.
Great, thank you for getting into that for us for a little bit as well. Question from Scott Colbert there in the chat box. As on the RA side, you talk about obviously there's a number of training opportunities, professional development, support mechanisms, and in particular focusing, among other things, on outreach, right? So in terms of training and opportunities for leaders of congregations from the USCJ standpoint, boards of directors and whatnot. You want to speak to maybe Sulam for a minute or two, or any other things you'd like to address there?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. First of all, you have a great resource in Mindy as your synagogue consultant, and I hope I hope your congregation leadership, I hope Shirley, you have a good relationship with her and others in the community. She knows the full set of resources, and whatever issues that come up as a congregation, I hope you're turning to her. And we do have a lot of resources that we can provide in terms of leadership training, and thinking about some of the complex issues that congregations deal with. Among those are our Sulam branded products. The one that I'm the biggest proponent for, quite frankly, is what we call Sulam for Emerging Leaders. It's for folks who are not yet on the board, or perhaps younger folks who you've brought on the board without a lot of previous synagogue leadership experience. I actually ran 3 cohorts of that in my own congregation here in Gaithersburg, and from each cohort, around 50 or 60% of them are now on our board and heading our committees. And the current president of my congregation is in his 30s. He's doing a great job. So, and it's all because, and much of it is because of the experience he had with that Sulam program. So, and I know Rabbi Sunshin has run that program, and I found it to be terrific. We also have Sulam programs for presidents, and for upcoming, the next in line to become presidents, for vice presidents. We have Sulam for strategic planning. There are a bunch of different pieces. By the way, our chief person for that, Bob Blumenthal, just wrote a new book. Rabbi Sunshine should have got a copy of it sometime in the last week or two. And it's a great resource, not only if you want to do a full sort of strategic planning process, but individual pieces of that could be used to discover congregation strengths, to discover certain pieces around conflict management or other kinds of things. So there are a lot of great resources. You can be in touch with me or Mindy, and we're happy to help make sure we have them available to you.
Thank you. So you've talked definitely around the margins of this, but let's just maybe sharpen this question up. We'll just go through. Do you remember offhand? I don't have it right in front of me. Bob Blumenthal's book, the title.
It is called. Do I have it back here? It is called. The name of it escapes me. Oh, here it is. See, I can even pull it off my shelf. Stepping Forward Together. Synagogue Visioning and Planning. There you go. On request.
Thank you.
Glad I had that.
That's right. Mine is in the other room. Yours is closer by, so it's an opportunity to grab it quick.
And it's just this is a real background, people.
That's right. That's right.
I didn't pull it out of the ether.
That's right. That's right. So, in your unique position, obviously, this is the first time where the RA and the USCJ has shared a chief executive position. Do you want to say anything? I mean, we're fortunate here at Cherith that have a wonderful partnership between our rabbinic and clergy leadership and our lay leaders. That is historically in congregations that has been much harder to predict and not really a guarantee. What do you sense there's in the movement, there's a changing approach or pattern to lay and rabbinic relationships, for example?
Well, so first of all, there needs to be. So if there isn't, it's got to happen. And Cherith is proof of that, right? The fact that much of the strength that you have as a congregation is the strength of your clergy and also its relationship with its lay leadership, and the ability to create a sense of joint mission, joint vision, and then an alignment of purpose and responsibilities to bring all of that together to create a successful congregation that thrives. And in the 21st century, we just cannot afford all of what I would call the Narishkeit of the politics of rabbis and congregations that don't get along, right? It won't work. And that, that's the relationship between rabbis and congregations, broader relationships among clergy and lay leaders, like all of that, it needs to be transformed into a sense of partnership and collaboration if our institutions are going to succeed with our synagogues and our bigger institutions as well. So that's one of the reasons, we decided that if that's going to be the case, we should start at the top. Like it would be ridiculous for the RA and United Synagogue to have a non-collaborative relationship, but tell every rabbi and cantor and congregation, oh, but you have to have a collaborative relationship. So it starts there. The second thing is that I think when I I worked a lot in the placement process as a volunteer with the RA and a lot of other spaces. And what I usually found is 80% of the time, those relationships are working well. There is actually a healthy collaboration and partnership. And there's 20% of the time where there are issues because we're human beings and we sometimes have different goals and we have to work those out and negotiate them through. Or it's not the right match, we need to make a change. And what I would prefer is for us to be structured for the 80% and figure out what to do about the 20% rather than the other way around. And we are finding that that it is creating dividends. You know, for the high holidays this year, the RA and USCJ, because of our partnership, was able to also collaborate together with the Candors Assembly and the Jewish Educators Assembly and JYDA, the youth directors. We brought everybody together to create a set of resources that congregations could use around, you know, halacha, around program sharing, round of other pieces. We created a website to bring all of that stuff together. And it was a great example of how, you know, folks could, you know, we could come together and demonstrate that kind of collaboration, and other congregations could benefit from it. So, yeah, you know, are there times, you know, there are moments when we're signing a contract, for example, so then, you know, all of a sudden we pull out of that space for a second to think about how are we going to negotiate, you know, a contractual relationship. But hopefully then, at least my experience was, you know, I was very blessed in my congregation to be able to then say, great, now we've got that straightened out. Now we put it aside, and now we come together again to talk about our mission, vision, and goals, and we keep moving forward.
Great. So we're just about out of time. So I got one more question for you, which hopefully will be a good way for us to wrap our conversation today. And it's really quite a simple question, but a good way to leave our community with some thoughts about both the USCJ and the RA. And really the question is, what is USCJ most proud of, and what is the RA most proud of in terms of the work that you're doing?
Well, first of all, I'm most proud of our congregations and our rabbis. And I don't just say that, you know, because, you know, that's where my salary comes from. I say it because every time I have this kind of interaction with congregations, I see the warmth of their Shabbat morning experience, or I'm with their boards, or when I'm talking with a colleague about what she is experiencing in her shul or in her Hillel. You know, first of all, it's just so inspiring to be that network of Jewish leaders, educators, professionals doing this work together. So our strength isn't so much even in our organizations. Our strength is in our memberships and our networks doing the work together. So I will just say that. I will say also that I think that USCJ and the RA are changing to become very focused on how we provide that kind of support and strengthen our connections to each other. Whether it's through our Sulam programs, whether it is through the upcoming Rabbinical Assembly Convention, the affinity groups that we've created for rabbis around different topics and areas, the educational programs that we have tripled this year, the ways that we have created new halacha, and the CJLS has become so responsive and much more relevant in creating the sense of the balance of tradition and change that we need for this moment.
Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, folks, for just a quick context there. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Helps us frame our Jewish legal.
So many initials, right? There is great energy and there are great resources that we're beginning to develop, and you know, the most important thing is for us to be in two-way communication about it. What is you know, what do you need, and how can we help provide that support? And then how can we partner together to get out of just our own, what we call Dalet Amot, our own 4, you know, cubits, our own 4 walls, and think about how we're going to make impact in a really big setting. And like I said in my Dvar Torah, how can we use even the challenges of our experience to crack open new possibilities, to see that water come forward that's going to provide Torah and nourishment, you know, for generations to come. That's what I'm focused on.
Wonderful. Well, Jacob, Rabbi Blumenthal, wonderful to have had you with us this Shabbat. It's great to share your Torah and your vision of what our movement is and can be. It's inspiring, I know, certainly to me, and to the rest of our colleagues here and around the country and around the world. And I hope it's just as inspiring for our lay leadership and members to see the kind of wonderful things that are going on. As you said, outside our Dalet Amot, outside our four walls or 4 feet, what have you, to see that there's a movement that's really making wonderful connections, sharing wonderful Torah and engagement, and helping communities build up and strengthen themselves as well. So, kol hakavod to you. We of course wish you lots of hatzlacha and lots of success in your continued endeavors. And we look forward to continuing to partner with you at both the USCJ and the RA fronts going forward.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you, both personally with you, Ari, and also with the larger congregation. Just great to be together. And I'm looking forward to when I can come to Dallas in person, give everybody a real hug, and and have a l'chaim together. So it's just good to be with you.
And a last funny anecdote, speaking about that, hopefully when that visit will come, a few of you might know that when Rabbi Blumenthal and I were doing our Hartman Fellowship together, we would make a practice when we were making our visits to Israel of we'd go to a nice meat kosher restaurant and we'd take a picture of the plate before and after, and usually leave like one little potato or something like that. Well, Rabbi Blumenthal, we have 8 kosher restaurants here in Dallas, so I can assure you, in your visit, we will be well fed, and we will have a wonderful meal. We'll take a picture. We'll let everybody see we broke bread together and enjoyed.
I am so there. I'm ready.